fortunate when I was listening to the presentations this morning by Professor Lucas and Dr. Jones, where they talked about team building and leadership, because my presentation today is on one of Canada's most distinguished leaders, Sir John A. Macdonald. Now, one of the reasons I thought I would speak about him was that last year, 2015, marked the bicentennial of his birth. It's therefore fitting, I think, that we take some time to honor his memory and his political contributions. Now, many distinguished Canadian historians have done a superb job of doing his political history, but nobody's ever talked about his Masonic background. And unfortunately, this gives us a very incomplete picture of Macdonald the man. Now, given the secrecy that surrounded Freemasonry in the 19th century, it's not surprising that we don't have this in his official biographies. If you look at his official papers, you'll see that Macdonald was a very private man, and his fraternal history therefore has to be gleaned by minute books and other various accounts, which I'm very pleased to present today. Now, while Kingston claims him as a native son, he actually was born in Glasgow, Scotland in January of 1815. In 1820, the Macdonald family immigrated to Kingston, Ontario to join other relatives. And as was the case with most immigrant families at the time, it was hard to get established. But somehow the family found enough money to send Macdonald to a decent school until he was 15 years old, and then it was out into the work field. He became an apprentice lawyer back in Kingston for George Mackenzie, and in later years Macdonald himself would say, and I quote, "I had no boyhood. From the age of 15, I began to earn my own living." But he acquitted himself very well as an apprentice lawyer and was called to the bar in 1836 at the age of 21, fully qualified to practice law. Now, the first major event in his life was the rebellion of 1837, because this confirmed his political views and he even got his start into Masonry. Now, in the years after the War of 1812, the colonial administration in Upper Canada, now our province of Ontario, became more and more conservative in the face of American expansion and what they thought was threats from the godless republic to the south. Their words, not mine, sorry. Now, the ruling group, the Family Compact, really started to abuse their power. The Anglican Church was favored over the Baptists, the Roman Catholics, and the Methodists. Other grievances included poor roads outside of Toronto, poor education, land grants to a select few, and just general political corruption. Now, by 1837, the grievances boiled into open revolt under the leadership of William Lyon Mackenzie. And Macdonald, as a young man of 22, was subject to the terms of the Militia Act and was called to arms. His regiment, the East Frontenac Militia, was called up. They were issued War of 1812 Army surplus Brown Bess flintlock muskets and learned British infantry drill. Now, at one point, Macdonald's colonel was so impressed that he was going to promote him to be an officer, but unfortunately for Macdonald's military career, the rebellion was put down before that could happen. Now, although he did not fire a shot in the rebellion, he did march to Toronto to take part in the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, which was over before he arrived. But this gave Macdonald the distinction of being to say, yes, I'm a veteran, I fought for the crown. Now, the events of the rebellion helped Macdonald's political views be confirmed. More and more, he saw that Upper Canada had a great future as part of British North America, but that the links to Great Britain had to be maintained. Because if they didn't have those links to Great Britain, the threat of annexation and republicanism from the United States would just be too great and we would be overwhelmed. Now, back across the Atlantic, the British government realized that they had really made a mess of things, so they decided to send out a very respected politician, Lord Durham, to be the Governor General of British North America. Now, he was very much respected by all accounts, very progressive for his time, and had the nickname of Radical Jack. And when he arrived in Upper Canada, he was given orders to find out what had happened and fix the problem. Now, he had a major advantage over many other colonial officials, is that he was a very popular British Freemason. So this opened doors to him all across the province at all social levels. Now, Lord Durham adopted a conciliatory attitude. He said that the problem of the rebellion was caused by neglect from the mother country as well as abuses from the Family Compact, and brought in a whole series of reforms. Now, one of the most serious reforms he brought in, which was very important for Macdonald's career, was that Upper and Lower Canada, today Ontario and Quebec, were to be united into a single province of the United Canadas. Ontario became Canada West, Quebec, Canada East, but we would be called the United Province of Canada at that point. Now, the capital had not been decided upon. Kingston was the capital for some sessions of Parliament, Montreal for others, and even Toronto at times. It moved back and forth. But with the events of the rebellion behind him and a new government in place, Macdonald was now free to concentrate on his own career. As a young lawyer, he took several hopeless but high-profile cases for people judged of such horrible crimes as murder and treason, probably a foregone conclusion that they would be executed, and it was one joke that if Macdonald defended you, you would probably be hung. But that was because he took on people that had no hope. And of course, one of the things in those days was that there was no television, no radio. Entertainment was often provided by the latest scandalous courtroom dramas in the newspapers. So Macdonald became a very well-known individual very shortly. He also got into business. He was involved in banking and real estate in Kingston, Montreal, and Toronto. And by 1843, he became an alderman in the city of Kingston. But then his career really took off in 1844 when he gained notoriety when he became elected as the Conservative member for the new provincial legislature for our United Province of Canada. Now, I just want to take a bit of an aside for a moment, and everybody always asks about Macdonald and drinking, and I wasn't going to bring it up, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't. Now, it's a legendary habit, and in fact, one of the brethren asked me, was I going to have a silver flask in my vest pocket in memory of Sir John? And yes, Sir John, this one's to you. Now, alcohol was a common feature in 19th century Canada. Any man who did not drink and drink to excess was regarded with suspicion. There had to be something wrong with him. Alcohol was inexpensive. It was produced in distilleries and breweries all over the province, and drinking to excess was expected at any social event like a wedding, funeral, barn raising, or whatever. And on the frontier, it was one of the few resources that were available for recreation. Even in Freemasonry, many lodges met above a tavern. The tiler would come in and chalk out the sacred symbols on the floor. They would hold the lodge meeting. After the lodge meeting, he'd rub them all out. Then they'd adjourn to a convenient room in the tavern, and drinking would resume. And in politics, if you were going to run for politics, you would have a keg of whiskey there because the voting was done by a show of hands. And so you would prime the pump, as it were, before the election was held. Now, Macdonald had the other issue about him was that his personal life was really a train wreck. It was not supportive. It wasn't happy. In 1842, he married Isabella Clark, but within 2 years she fell ill, never recovered. They had a son named John, who was born in 1847. He died a year later. He did have another son who did live to adulthood, fortunately, but his wife died in 1857 and left him as a widower with a 7-year-old boy. He married another lady, Agnes Bernard. They had a daughter. The daughter was born with severe mental and physical disabilities. She never learned how to walk until much later. So, as they say, his personal life was really pretty terrible. Now, his drinking became scandalous even by 19th century standards, but his quick wit had a way of turning this character flaw into an advantage. And there's one well-known and actual true story that he was in a debate, very much like they are having debates in the United States right now, on stage, and he was debating with his opponent from the Clear Grid or the Liberal Party. And at one point, Macdonald got up to speak, and he'd had too much to drink, and he threw up on stage. So the Liberal candidate looked over, and he pointed very self-righteously. He said, "Is this the man you want representing you, a common drunk?" Macdonald got up, and he wiped himself with his handkerchief and regained his composure, and he said, "Gentlemen, I get sick, not because of the drink, but because of the rantings of my honorable opponent." And unfortunately, the honorable opponent, he was just wiped out. That was it. Now, fraternal orders in general, and Freemasonry in particular, played an important role in the developing 19th century Canadian frontier community. Masonic lodges were usually the first building built and marked the march of civilization into the forest. The lodge offered the membership to meet socially, to discuss problems, and to basically just have a place where they could gather as friends. Now, as an up-and-coming young lawyer, it was only natural for Macdonald to look at the fraternal orders. He joined the Loyal Orange Lodge. He joined the International Order of Odd Fellows. And this is typical because Masons at the time joined many other concordant bodies and even derivative bodies. However, it was a Mason that Macdonald was best known and made his greatest fraternal contributions. Now, in the 1840s, Freemasonry in Upper Canada, or Canada West as it was then known, was still somewhat in the frontier area. The Provincial Grand Lodge of Upper Canada was making a valiant attempt to provide leadership, but many lodges still looked to the leadership of the Grand Lodge of Ireland or the United Grand Lodge of England, or basically just met by immemorial right. However, Macdonald wanted to be a member of a lodge in good standing, so he applied to St. John's Lodge number 5 in Kingston, now known as the Ancient St. John's Lodge number 3. And he was balloted for an open lodge in March of 1844. He was initiated March 14th in that year. He then was passed on April the 22nd, 1844, and raised to the 3rd degree on June 27th, 1844. They put him through very quickly because they were obviously very pleased to have such a prominent member of the community. Now, the minute books of that lodge show that he did not necessarily attend lodge at every meeting, given his busy schedule, but he was a frequent visitor. He never held office in that lodge, but remained a member for his whole life. Now, once Brother Macdonald became a Mason, his next logical step was to become a member of the Royal Arch. And in those days, in the 1840s and 50s, that was almost the foregone conclusion, and was much more commonplace than it may be today. Now, if you look at the United Grand Lodge of England's Book of Constitution for that era, this will give you an idea of why it was almost expected. By the solemn act of union between the two Grand Lodges of Freemasons of England in 1813, it was declared and pronounced that pure ancient Masonry consists of 3 degrees, those of the entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, including the Supreme Order of the Holy Royal Arch. And it was basically expected you would do that in those days. So Brother Macdonald was exalted to the supreme degree of the Holy Royal Arch in Victoria Chapter, Montreal in 1847. And later on in this presentation, I'll talk about just how important this became for him politically. He later then joined Cataraqui Chapter number 12 in Kingston and, was quite actively involved in the Royal Arch. But seeking even further light in Masonry, Brother Macdonald looked to the Knights Templar, and he submitted a petition for membership to the Hugh Payne's Preceptory in Kingston in 1854 and was elected first captain in 1855. Now, since we're in the Scottish Rite, and many of the brethren here I imagine are Scottish Rite members, you may ask me, well, why didn't he join the Scottish Rite? Well, that order did not really get established in Ontario until about 1868, and I think we have to give Brother Macdonald some understanding that even a man with his boundless energy could only do so much. Now, in spite of Macdonald's best efforts as a politician and member of the legislature of the United Canadas, politics in the province from about 1851 to 66 was pretty difficult. Now, without going into great details, perhaps the greatest challenge of all was how do we unite men, English-speaking in Ontario, and when I say English-speaking, that includes Irish, German, English, Scottish. It's not just English Canadians. Then in Quebec, we have French Canadians who speak French, of course. Now, any kind of meaningful legislation coming out of this new union of the two provinces had to have some kind of accommodation between groups with different interests. Now, on a fraternal level, the idea of accommodation of men of all backgrounds sounds very much like the Masonic universal brotherhood of man from the Enlightenment. Masonic lodges in the 19th century were well known as a place where men of all religious backgrounds, all ethnic backgrounds, even at the time including Jewish members and Aboriginal Canadians. Now, Brother Macdonald was a firm believer in the brotherhood of man, and he was determined to work through these local regional differences to make the legislature work. And he quickly gained the respect of French-Canadian politician Georges-Étienne Cartier, who became his lifelong political supporter. And as a measure of the way that Brother Macdonald was able to unite teams, as we're talking about this morning, The Loyal Orange Lodge, which is an Irish Protestant organization, supported him, and the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec supported him. So very, very much the conciliatory and able to bring people together. Now, Macdonald was the major player in the choice of the permanent location for the Parliament of this new United Province of Canada. Quebec City, Toronto, Kingston, they all vied for this, but it was decided that no, that's too close to the American border, that all the Americans had to do was come across the Great Lakes and they could capture the province's capital, and that would be it. So Macdonald therefore prepared a briefing cabinet for the British Colonial Office, saying that Ottawa was far enough away, but with the Rideau Canal had good transportation and railroads, so that would be the best idea. Queen Victoria in 1859 gave royal assent. Now, the only problem to this was that Ottawa was just a rough and tumble lumber town and didn't have any buildings that were suitable for this new legislature. So the contract to design the new Parliament buildings was awarded to a prominent Ottawa Freemason named Thomas Fuller in 1859. He'd only just come out from England 2 years before, but quickly founded an architectural firm that specialized in stone buildings. Now, the first actual step in the construction was the laying of a cornerstone on September 1st, 1860. In the 19th century, construction of most prominent buildings was begun with the formal Masonic ceremony of laying the cornerstone, presided over by the Grand Master, or at least his local district deputy Grand Master. And in fact, I will remind the brethren that our own Grand Master today is at a cornerstone laying in Rideau Ferry, so the tradition continues. Now, given Fuller's Masonic background, the Masonic connection of several prominent politicians such as Macdonald, and the prestige of the construction project, like these huge, beautiful stone buildings, the desire for a Masonic cornerstone ceremony was just a foregone conclusion. However, the upcoming visit of His Royal Highness Edward Albert, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, complicated the plans for the ceremony. Although the Prince eventually became the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1874, he was not a Mason in 1860 at the time of his visit. Now, if the craft were going to be present at this cornerstone ceremony, the cornerstone laying ceremony, protocol demanded that the Grand Master had to officiate. But protocol also demanded that if the son of Queen Victoria was there, he had to have some kind of role too. So at one point it was thought, well, maybe we'll get the prince and we will initiate, pass, and raise him in one meeting, and then he can become a Mason and he can take part in the ceremony. But that was that was a good suggestion, but it was rejected because the timing was off. Now, Macdonald, as the Attorney General, wrote to the Grand Master, Most Worshipful Brother Harrington, to ask if the Masons would attend in a body, and promised to bring the matter to the attention of the Governor General. The Governor General thought this was a great idea and approved, but noted the Prince had to give the final approval. Now, given the state of mail at the time and the fact that the Prince was traveling all about the province, his aides were almost impossible to reach. Now, if any of you have ever worked in the federal government, you know what it's like to deal with bureaucracies all the way from Rideau Hall to the Public Works, back and forth, and get approval from this person and that person. Sadly, the Prince did not get his invitation. There was not enough time to work this out, and when the cornerstone was laid, the Prince laid it, but he did not have a Masonic delegation there officially to support him. Now, the matters got even worse. And again, if you've worked in the federal government, you'll sympathize with this, that problems that you didn't create, you often have to apologize for. An anonymous writer in London Freemasons magazine said this was a disgrace that the Grand Master was not in attendance, and criticized the Grand Master for, called him disrespectful names, and really went on a great rant. And of course, Macdonald realized this was unfair. It wasn't the Grand Master's fault. It's just that they couldn't pull it all together given the situation. So Macdonald had the task of writing a letter of apology to the Grand Master, and I'll just read the one sentence. Although the services of the Masonic body were not made use of on the occasion of the laying of the cornerstone of Parliament, no slight to the order or its Grand Master, with whom we were in pleasant communication, was intended or imagined, nor were you in any way snubbed. And Grand Master Harrington said, yes, I understand that, and thank you very much. Now, continuing to work his magic during the 1860s in politics, Macdonald eventually served as premier in a coalition with Sir Etienne Taché from Quebec, but interested this time all across British North America in the colonies of New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia were growing into some kind of union, that there could be more than just the union of Ontario and Quebec. George Brown, Macdonald's former political enemy, but now his coalition partner, and leaders from all of the British colonies met in Charlottetown in Quebec City in 1864. And working together as a team, under Macdonald's leadership, they laid the foundation for a proposed confederation of all of the colonies of British North America into one country. The group then traveled to London to present plans to the British Parliament and Queen Victoria, who were generally in agreement with the idea of this transition from a colony to some kind of nation. But before they became law, Queen Victoria and the House of Commons in England still had to approve this. Now, this group of politicians I mentioned, that's the Fathers of Confederation that I think we all remember studying in public school. One member of that Fathers of Confederation group, just as an aside, was a gentleman named Sir Alexander Campbell. He was a member of Ancient St. John's No. 3 in Kingston and joined the same year as Macdonald, 1844. He articled as an apprentice lawyer in Macdonald's law office and would remain one of his lifelong friends and political ally. Over the years, Macdonald gave him significant cabinet posts, and he even served as lieutenant governor of Ontario from 1887 to 92. Now, at the same time that Macdonald was pushing for Confederation in Canada, he became increasingly concerned over events unfolding in the United States and the impact these would have on Canada. The struggles over the issues of states' right and the abolition of slavery ultimately culminated in the American Civil War of 1861 to 65. Now, the real scary time for Macdonald came at the end of the war, because with the end of hostilities in 1865, the Union government of the United States had trained and equipped an army of well over 1 million men, the largest army in the world and the best trained army in the world, because they had just fought a 4-year war. To make matters worse, Great Britain had openly supported the Confederacy during the war by buying Confederate cotton and then shipping them British-made Enfield rifled muskets. Macdonald was afraid that the Union government would look at all these unemployed soldiers and say, well, there's Canada, all we have to do is march north and take it. And that would be in retaliation, and they would have every right because of the way that Britain had supported the Confederacy. An organization called the United Fenian Brotherhood was the final push that Britain and Canada needed to complete the idea of Confederation. In the summer of 1866, unemployed Irish-American Union veterans of the Civil War organized themselves into a group known as the United Fenian Brotherhood, or just the Fenians. They planned to capture Canada, hold it, and then trade it back to Britain for the freedom of Ireland. Now, this may sound like kind of a bit of a half-brained plan if you haven't read about them, but these were experienced combat veterans. They launched invasions in New Brunswick, Canada East, and Canada West. The local militia was called out, and although the Fenians were beaten on the battlefield, many Canadians were killed, wounded, and maimed permanently. Canadians were alarmed to see that the American government did nothing to stop these groups from coming over the border, and they just turned a blind eye to it, probably hoping that the Fenians would succeed. The colonies in British North America finally realized that we either have to unite or die. We will be absorbed by the Americans if we don't. So, with the passing of the British North America Act on the 1st of July, 1867, the colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario were united into one country, Canada. Lord Monck, Governor General, appointed John A. Macdonald as Prime Minister, and he was given the title Sir John A. Macdonald. Canada would have authority over all matters internal, such as building railroads. However, as a self-governing dominion, we still had to look to Britain for our foreign policy and sovereignty over external affairs. Now, at this point in time, Macdonald had a little bit of time to get back into Freemasonry. In 1868, he was contacted unofficially by the Grand Master, the Most Worshipful Brother William Mercer Wilson, who said that our most important ally in the world, and since we are part of the empire, is Great Britain. And he said, we are looking for a suitable representative to the United Grand Lodge of England. Would you consider being that if you were so named? Now, this actually kind of took Macdonald aback. And, a lot of people may think Macdonald was an arrogant individual. He wasn't. He was very humble. And he was deeply honored to be asked, but he didn't in any way assume this would just come to him as a matter of course. So he humbly wrote a letter to the Grand Master in March of 1868, And these are the words he said. I have to acknowledge receipt of your favor, congratulating me upon the honor conferred upon me by the Grand Lodge of England in appointing me their representative to the Grand Lodge of Canada. I need scarcely assure you that I highly appreciate the honor, although I feel that I am unable to worthily to fill the position. I shall, however, with your fraternal assistance, do my best. The annual proceedings for Grand Lodge 1868, and I quote from page 466, documented the honor the Grand Master, Most Worshipful Brother William Mercer Wilson stated, I have much pleasure in announcing that the Most Worshipful, the Earl of Zetland, Grand Master of England, has been pleased to appoint our distinguished and eminent brother, the Honorable Sir John A. Macdonald, as representative of that august body in this, our Canadian Grand Lodge. Now, Right Worshipful Brother Macdonald's grand regalia as past Grand Senior Warden was presented to him at Grand Lodge in 1868, and interestingly, that regalia survives to this day. His apron, his collar, and his gauntlets are in excellent condition. They were treated by conservators from Queen's University in Kingston, and this irreplaceable Masonic treasure is exhibited at the Masonic Temple in Kingston, Ontario to this day. Now, while Macdonald would retain his membership in Ancient St. John's Lodge in Kingston for life, his residency was 1868 in Ottawa. It's not surprising that he would look for Masonic fellowship in that city. So on April 13th, 1869, he applied to join Civil Service Lodge number 138 in Ottawa. Not surprisingly, his motion for membership was accepted. He must have enjoyed Freemasonry in Ottawa because in 1870 he joined Dalhousie Lodge number 52. And both those lodges are still at work today. But getting back to Royal Arch Masonry, with Confederation established in 1867, Macdonald was obliged to contend with one very serious problem, and that was external relations with the United States. In 1870, there were several points of contention. I can't list them all, they're so numerous, but basically the requirements were that, first of all, Canada was very upset because of all the expenses incurred from the Fenian raids from the United States. The Americans were upset at Britain and therefore Canada because of the support Britain had given the Confederacy. American fishermen wanted free access to Canadian waters. The list just went on and on and on. And all these demands threatened to actually absorb the new country. Now, as a self-governing dominion in 1871, that meant we could only govern our internal affairs, not external. So that meant that the British government had to be the ones to work this problem out. So it was decided that a group of British diplomats would go to Washington to meet with the Americans to resolve all these conflicts. Sir John A. Macdonald, as Prime Minister of Canada, would come, but he would come as part of the British delegation, not as a separate Canadian delegation. Now, the British government in England made it very, very clear to Macdonald and the rest of the members that they wanted a workable treaty and they didn't care what the cost was. Now, Macdonald had to support the British position, but Macdonald was very afraid of what might happen with the British because at this point in time, many Americans believed that Great Britain had no position, no place in North America, and they thought that England should just give Canada to the United States. Macdonald thought maybe this would happen. And in Canada, it was obvious that Britain was getting tired of all the expense that maintaining these colonies would do. Like every year, millions of pounds sterling were poured into the fortifications at Esquimalt and in Halifax, just as examples. Now, another point of order that Macdonald had to contend with, and that it was bad enough that he had to almost wear two hats, the home government gave very strict orders to the British delegation that Her Majesty Queen Victoria would not sign a treaty that was phrased in imperfect grammar. And specifically, no split infinitives were to be used, like to, adjective, and then verb. So, for example, the phrase, to boldly go where no man has gone before, that just sort of thing, that just would not go. Now, in official meetings, Macdonald, from the very first day, became unpopular with both the American and British delegation, I'm saying in official meetings, because of his unbending Canadian views that Canada had to be protected. But his membership in his Royal Arch chapter actually helped to solve this, because Companion Macdonald, as a Royal Arch Mason, along with the other members of the British delegation, paid fraternal visits to Lafayette Chapter number 5 in Washington, D.C. Macdonald was so popular on a fraternal level with the Americans that he was made an honorary life member of the American chapter. Now, worshipful brother Mark Tabbert of the George Washington Masonic Memorial is familiar with Lafayette Chapter, and he provided some information on the 1871 roster of membership of Lafayette Chapter. And let me just read some of the names. First of all, Right Honorable Marquis of Ripon, who was the British chairman of the Joint Commission for the Treaty of Washington. Another British diplomat, Right Honorable Lord Tenterden. But then there's also William Jones Hugon, an American Masonic historian. Sir John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister of Canada. Albert G. Mackey, an American Masonic historian, most of you know. And then for the Scottish Rite members, Albert Pike was also a member of this chapter. Now think about this for a second. Albert Pike, okay, he's the Scottish Rite philosopher and historian, but he had been a supporter of the Confederacy only 5 years before. Somehow the chapter was able to unite Confederates, Union, British, Canadians. So as Brother Tabbert reflected after sending me this list, he says, quote, "There's a lot more going on in that chapter than just one ennobled Canadian." Lafayette Chapter clearly provided an opportunity for Macdonald to discuss and resolve controversial issues with American and British representatives on a more relaxed, personal, private atmosphere. When the Treaty of Washington was finally signed on May 8, 1871, Macdonald firmly believed that Canadian interests had in fact been preserved. In international law, the Treaty of Washington to this day is given as a model of how nations should confer back and forth with each other, and just, I think, keep in mind, a lot of that happened because of Lafayette Chapter. Now, if you would like to see a reminder of Sir John A. Macdonald's Royal Arch career, just look out in the lobby out there in that one exhibit case, and his Royal Arch jewel he was given in 1847 in Montreal is displayed in the window box out there. Now, the period after Confederation in 1867 is called the era of Canadian nation building. Now, given the prominence that Macdonald had now secured, he'd solved the problem of the Treaty of Washington. He was now going to unite the country, get the rest of the colonies of British North America, like British Columbia and Prince Rupert's Land, as part of Confederation. Now, I think everyone knows the story of how in 1867 we were scattered, but by 1885 the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway was driven to unite the country. The Northwest Mounted Police were created and sent west to provide peace, order, and good government to Canadian settlers. So that's all very well known. So let's get back to the Masonic story. Now, in one period from 1873 to 1878, Macdonald found himself, unfortunately, as leader of the opposition because he had allegedly taken money inappropriately during the Pacific scandal during the construction of the railroad. But this gave him time to affiliate with yet another Masonic lodge. So he spent quite a bit of time at Zetland Lodge number 326 in Toronto. Now, he maintained his connections with his lodges in Ottawa as well, and went back and forth between Kingston and visited his lodge there. I can't think of a brother who could have traveled even today. That's an admirable record. Now, railroads, of course, continued to occupy much of Macdonald's attention, but the other thing that a lot of people forget about was that transportation on the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, was extremely important in the 19th century. So given the importance of this to the Canadian economy, it's no wonder that Macdonald championed the construction of the dry docks at Kingston. And on June the 9th, 1890, Macdonald was present for the laying of the cornerstone for the new dry docks in Kingston. It was an event of great public success. It was held in the Frontenac Hotel. There were lovely menus printed up with Sir John A. Macdonald as the guest of honor. But at that time, in that happy occasion, nobody realized that that was going to be his last official event ever. Now, in 1891, another election was called. The platform for the Conservatives was the old flag, the old politics, the old leader. Macdonald campaigned tirelessly. But the Conservatives were returned with a majority, but the strain of the campaign was just too much for him. He became ill from exhaustion. He suffered a stroke and passed to the Grand Lodge above on June 6, 1891, at his home in Ottawa. His body lay in state in Ottawa and was then transferred by a funeral train for the final trip to Kingston. And on that day, in the best Victorian traditions of mourning, the steam locomotive that pulled the train was draped in black crepe, and every single locomotive on the CPR roster wore black crepe that day. Now, Right Worshipful Brother Macdonald did not have a Masonic memorial service, but the brethren of his mother lodge, ancient St. John's, attended the funeral service in Kingston in a body. Other Masonic lodges, such as Zetland Lodge in Toronto, where he was a past member, held special commemorative services. And the entire nation, Masonic and non-Masonic, was in deep mourning. Right Worshipful Brother Macdonald is buried in Cataraqui Cemetery just outside Kingston. His gravestone does not have a Masonic square and compasses, but then neither do many of the Grand Masters of that era. However, in a final bit of Masonic connection, Macdonald's Masonic brother and political ally, you remember I mentioned Sir Alexander Campbell, who had worked in his law office. He was instrumental in the formation of Cataraqui Cemetery and acted as its first president. So the cemetery holds the distinction of being the only cemetery in Canada with two fathers of Confederation, brethren Macdonald and Campbell, both Freemasons, both fathers of Confederation, both members of St. John's Lodge No. 3. Now in conclusion, politically I don't have to go into great detail, that's been done by others, but I think we can say that he was a powerhouse of energy, boundless personal energy and devotion. He spent his life directing the evolution of Canada from a colony to a nation. He had the CPR built as part of his vision, and if it wasn't for John A. Macdonald, we would not have the Canada that we know today. In terms of being able to unite all Canadians, Henri Bourassa, a fervent French-Canadian nationalist and founder of Le Devoir newspaper, had great respect for Macdonald, the politician and father of Confederation. In 1921, he said of Macdonald that he was, and I quote, the one man who best understood and applied the spirit of Confederation. I think we can best sum up his political legacy in two of his own quotes, and I quote, this is from Macdonald, "My sins of omission and commission I do not deny, but I trust that it may be said of me in the ultimate issue, much is forgiven because he loved much, for I have loved my country with a passionate love." And then he said, if I had the influence over the minds of the people of Canada, any power over their intellect, I would leave them with this legacy. Whatever you do, adhere to the Union. We are a great country and shall become one of the greatest in the universe if we preserve it. If we allow it to sink into insignificance and adversity in this country, we will suffer it to be broken and will regret it forever. What do we make of Right Worshipful Brother Macdonald the Mason? Well, in 1891, the year in which he passed to the Grand Lodge above, the Grand Master, Most Worshipful Brother John Ross Robertson, said of him, another brother prominent in matters political as First Minister of the Crown, Sir John A. Macdonald, representative of the Grand Lodge of England near the Grand Lodge of Canada, has gone to his last home. The Right Worshipful Brother always looked upon the fraternity with kindly favor and was proud of his connection with Masonry. That connection with Masonry that the Grand Master noted of such a prominent individual gave great respectability and legitimacy to the Grand Lodge of Canada. This was in an era when other Grand Lodges such as the Orange Lodge and the United Workmen and other lodges were trying to get membership, and Brother Macdonald, by his endorsement of being a member of our body, gave great respectability and prestige to the Grand Lodge of Canada. And that is one of the reasons that the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario has become the premier grand jurisdiction in the country today. Now, in spite of his busy political life, he did find time to attend lodge. This would have been a safe refuge away from the problems of home and political life. Finally, he started the tradition where it's considered appropriate for a prime minister of this country to be a Mason. Since Confederation, there's been 23 prime ministers. 6 of them have been Masons. They include Brethren Macdonald, Abbott, Bowell, Borden, Bennett, and finally Diefenbaker. And then finally, his political career evolved in parallel with his Masonic career. He became a Mason under the Provincial Grand Lodge of Upper Canada and died as a Grand Lodge officer of the Grand Lodge of Canada of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons in the province of Ontario. So let me just summarize his Masonic contributions by referring to one quote, which you will all know. "May you live respected and die regretted." Thank you.